Hello, everybody. I hope you're having a great day. I am filming this one actually not late at night. It's only 7:45, but I'm tired, so I feel like it's late at night. So I'm going to try to go through this quickly. Basically, we just want to review the types of development or the measures of development and how we know if a country is developed or not. Um, as you know, Unit 7 will not be on the AP exam anymore. So I'm cutting out some of the more complicated stuff and really just trying to focus on like big picture takeaways that I really think you need to know, just kind of moving on with life. When we talk about even like the coronavirus, I mean, why does it seem like it's affecting different countries in these vastly different ways? Having a little bit of an understanding about economic development, I think, will help us have a little bit of a better understanding about current events and future current events. So, having said that, go ahead and get started. Sorry. Okay, so we're going to talk about measures of development. In other words, how do we know if a country is considered to be a developed country or not? So we've talked about the United States, and we know that the United States is an MDC, but how do we quantify that? How do we decide which countries are MDCs and which countries are not? It's similar to talking about athletes or, I don't know, musicians or writers or whatever the case might be. We know when we like somebody, we know when someone is good, but we're asking you to dig a little bit deeper and tell me, how do you decide? Like, what are you measuring that allows you to decide if somebody is the greatest quarterback or the greatest author or whatever metric you're using? So, looking at measures of development, specifically to countries, obviously, there are some major concepts of development that you want to be familiar with. We have used pretty much all of these terms at some point in the year, so it's just kind of a refresher. There is developed versus underdeveloped. And that's something to kind of keep in mind that, really, there's probably no such thing as like an undeveloped country. To say that nowhere within the country has any kind of economic development and, that nobody within the country is wealthy, that there's no modern area of a country is kind of unrealistic. Then developing, sometimes people use as kind of a middle ground term, when we think that a country is like sort of in between an MDC and an LDC. So some of the assignments that I've asked you guys to do this week, the one about measures of development and the one about HDI, there were a couple examples of countries that are sort of in the middle. And it's like, where do we quantify those? Like, how do we decide where they fit? So we kind of use this word developing as a stopgap of a country that, on the demographic transition, we might call that a stage 3 country. Of course, LDC versus MDC, less developed country versus more developed country. And then NICs, I think we covered at some point, but I can't recall. I'm sorry. So NICs are newly industrialized countries. Those, again, would be what I would think of as like the stage 3 countries from the demographic transition. So to me, this is countries like Mexico, countries like India, countries like China. I'm sure a lot of others that are just slipping my mind right now, but those are 3 that I think of right away as being NICs, newly industrialized countries. You don't need to know everything on this slide. Basically, the idea here is just to explain why we came up with HDI, or Human Development Index, in the first place. So the United Nations actually created the HDI, and the slide does say that it was created in 1990. Basically, the idea behind it is saying, GDP is important. The level of wealth certainly does tell you something. The level of wealth does tell you if a country is wealthy or not. But, just the way we talk about saying like money can't buy you happiness, money can't necessarily buy you human development either. Just because you're wealthy doesn't mean that the people in your country are being well educated or that the people in your country are being well cared for. So that's why we choose to measure other things. Things like life expectancy, it's a good one. It's an important one. but it can be a little bit specific. And honestly, the more we learn about the human body, we're realizing that some discrepancies in life expectancy possibly could be genetic. So it's not always a fair and balanced representation of um, development. And think about again like what we're going through now with the coronavirus. If we made a population pyramid right now for Italy or China, it would have a really weird blip right now on the pyramid of a generation of people that are missing, or maybe are going to have lower reproduction in the future because of this generation of people that are being killed. And I know most of them were elderly, but still. So the HDI measures education, measures GDP, measures life expectancy. And that gives us a little bit more of an overall picture. And hopefully you should be familiar with it at this point. You did an assignment based on HDI. This is just kind of clarifying information. This map is just showing you the places in the world that have higher levels of human development and lower levels of human development. So we have determined that a country is highly developed if it's 0.8 or higher. You can see it's like all of North America, large chunks of South America, most of Europe, Russia, a lot of areas that maybe we're less familiar with. Middle would be that like yellow golden color. It's 0.5 to 0.8. So you see all throughout Asia and like Southwest Asia, South Asia in general, Southeast Asia. Remember, this is 2008. Things have changed since then. This is just a map that I already had, honestly. So, and then the red would be lower human development. And really, we see that clustered heavily in like Western Africa, Central Africa. How does HDI work? Sorry. The UN looks at GDP per capita, life expectancy, and an educational index. All of this stuff is review. Basically, I'm just looking here. A perfect country will have an HDI of 1.00. Remember, it is an index, so it can't go over 1.00. And it can't go under, theoretically, like 0.00. I guess it could be negative, but most indexes are 1.00. The United States was number 8 on the HDI charts in 2015. I'm not sure where we stand today, honestly. But basically what we see in terms of HDI is that a lot of wealthy countries are really, really clustered at the top. So we have multiple countries with scores of like 0.94, 0.93, 0.92, 0.91. And it's hard to say that life in a 0.92 country is better than life in a 0.91 country. I mean, such a negligible difference. And obviously, we know that people's lived experiences vary. Like some people would say life in America is great, things are awesome, we have all this wealth and health. And many other people are living a very different experience and saying that there are all these things that America needs to change. So just keep that in mind when we're generalizing countries. It might make the study of AP Human simpler, which is fine, but you are generalizing actual humans. So just keep that in mind. Some issues with HDI. I think I just mentioned all this stuff. That a lot of these countries are really, really similar, and it's hard to define like what makes them better or worse than another. So if you are taking notes on this, you do not need to take notes on this slide. I've got another map here of HDI, and again, we did just see something similar. This one is showing you countries that are on the highest level of human development, 0.9. Then we've got 0.7, 0.5, below 0.5. But ultimately, you can see similar pattern to what we saw in the previous map. You might notice that Brazil is not colored anymore and Argentina is not colored anymore. Remember, the index on the other one was 0.8, whereas this one is set higher at 0.9. So that's why they fit into, it's like 0.82, 0.84, something like that. So that's why they've changed color in this map. My screencastify bar, I keep having to move it. Development, again, we've talked about all this stuff. What I really want you to know is this bolded statement here. Development is the improvements in standard of living and quality of life that follow on from a country becoming richer. And that's not the most eloquent way to say it, but basically, development occurs as a country becomes wealthier. And we can see that in a personal level too. You know, if you think about somebody like a Steve Jobs or like a Bill Gates or I don't know. I don't want to say Kylie Jenner because she was born rich, but somebody that was maybe not born super wealthy. When you track their story on a personal level, you see, you know, when they become wealthy, there's certain things that they start investing in first. And then you reach a certain level of wealth where it's like you can outsource all these tasks that you don't want to do for yourself. You know, you can get a chef and you can get a housekeeper and you can get a gardener and you can get a pool boy or something. I don't know, whatever rich people have that improves their quality of life, at least in theory. So really, that's kind of a microcosm of what happens to society. Maybe society's not getting pool boys, but you know, the wealthier countries, we can invest more in social issues. We can invest more in education, and that's something that we really benefit from being wealthy. I wanted to review this with you. So you should have read this the other day, but just really quickly, when we are trying to study if a country is developed or not, use that example I gave you of the athlete or the author or the actor or whoever. You know, think about when we're trying to decide what makes someone good at their craft. Typically, it is not just one thing. Like they won the Super Bowl one time, or they won the Masters one time, or they won an Oscar one time. You know, it's repeated performances, repeated excellence, and being good in multiple categories. Same thing we see with human development. So you can be rich and still be underdeveloped. You can have great social development and potentially not be wealthy. You can have great demographic development and potentially have terrible social development. So it's really a total package. We're looking at economic indicators, social indicators, and demographic indicators. Remember, GDP per capita basically is the total value of your country's economy divided by the population. So it is not necessarily what my check is or your parents' check is or the president's check is. It's the total value of the American economy divided by the population. Types of jobs, that's the sectors. Remember, there's the primary sector of raw material extraction, things like agriculture, things like forestry, fishing, mining, secondary sector, manufacturing or processing of raw goods. And then the tertiary sector is the service sector. Raw materials, just the actual availability of raw materials that are desirable, you know, crude oil, natural gas, gold, diamonds, silicon, all kinds of things like that. Productivity, basically how much productivity your people are able to generate. And then consumer goods, you know, the availability of consumer goods demonstrates the wealth of a country. Social indicators of development, education, and literacy. Remember, that would be like the expected years of educational attainment. So, for instance, in America, you have basically 13 years of expected education, kindergarten, year one, through 12th grade. So that would add up to 13 school years. And then literacy is the literacy rate among people that are 15 years of age and older, because obviously, you know, someone like my 6-year-old son that is learning to read, I wouldn't say is necessarily fully literate. So we don't measure literacy in young children. We start 15 and up. Health and welfare, access to healthcare, number of doctors per capita, cost of healthcare, lots of things like that. And then demographic indicators of development, life expectancy, natural increase rate. Remember, that is the birth rate minus the death rate. Infant mortality rate, that is the rate of babies, remember, that are born and then die later. That does not count for abortions or miscarriages. That does not count for stillbirth. It's babies that are born and then die later. And then the crude birth rate in general, just how many babies are born per 1,000 people. All that stuff was in Rubenstein. I had you read it. This is just a review. The more and less developed regions of the world in general, the more developed regions, Anglo-America, as in Canada and the United States, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Japan, and the South Pacific primarily being Australia. The less developed regions of the world, Latin America, so Mexico, Central America, South America, the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, places like Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam, Cambodia, etc. South Asia, that would be India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh. East Asia would be China and Korea. North and South. Well, South Korea would be an MDC. North Korea is an LDC. The Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa. So that was Africa, again, south of the Saharan, like Central Africa. This is a map demonstrating the more and less developed regions. If you see this red line here, this is dividing the world between north and south, with the exception of Australia and New Zealand. The north is the MDC region of the world. The south is the LDC region of the world. That red line is called the Brandt line. And that is BRANDT, like the word brand with a T on the end. The Brandt line divides the world between north and south. And people will talk about that sometimes, the north-south division. The MDCs, again, are in the north. LDCs are in the south. Australia messes it up, so we kind of ignore them, but they are part of the global north, even though they're actually in the south because they're wealthy. I hope that you're going to get this information tomorrow, but I just wanted to briefly talk about gender and inequality. So the UN has created this Gender Inequality Index. Again, it is based on 1.00, any index. They're looking at multiple metrics here. They're looking at empowerment, the labor force, and reproductive health. Empowerment is defined as the ability of women to achieve improvements in status. So basically, thinking about, if you've heard of the term the glass ceiling, kind of this invisible barrier that like women couldn't necessarily rise above. We want to know what ability women have to improve their status if they choose to do so. So some of the ways that we look at that, the percentage of seats that are held by women in the national legislature, and the percentage of women who have completed high school. In the United States, there are actually more women enrolled in college than men, so keep that in mind for future prospects. The percentage of seats held in the national legislature, America is roughly 26%, I believe, right now, between the House and the Senate. Labor force, the female labor force participation rate is defined as the percentage of women holding full-time jobs outside of the home. Remember, when we talk about things like unemployment or we talk about the labor force, people in the labor force, these are people that are actively looking for jobs. So this is not a stay-at-home mom. This is not a retired grandmother. This is not, you in my 9th grade AP Human class. This is women that are looking for jobs. And then reproductive health, the maternal mortality ratio, and the adolescent fertility rate. Maternal mortality refers to the number of women that die in childbirth or directly after. And then adolescent fertility, the teen pregnancy rate. Both of those numbers we want to be low in MDCs and really everywhere. But when they are higher, that's an indication that maybe women are treated unequally in that society. So when the numbers are lower, it's an indication that people are spending the money on healthcare for women and children, and obviously pregnancy prevention and all these other things. Okay. We're going to spend just a little bit of time now looking at a couple of different countries. I want you to think about in your mind, would you quantify them as an LDC, a less developed country, an MDC, a more developed country, or maybe an NIC, a newly industrialized country? So the first one we're going to look at is Bhutan. It is in, I guess you would say, South Asia. It's kind of on the border between South Asia and Southeast Asia. So here's India, here's Nepal, this is the Himalayas, this is where Everest is, here's Bhutan. So just because it's not in Nepal doesn't mean it's not mountainous. It is a very mountainous part of the world. And there's your helpful arrow. Make sure you see it. Small mountainous country. They live a traditional agricultural lifestyle. The majority of people there, I believe, are Buddhist. Let me see if there's anything else on there. Social, medical, and environmental difficulties. Like I mentioned, they live in the Himalayan mountain region, which presents a lot of challenges, as you can imagine. So looking just at the information on this screen, decide for yourself, LDC, NIC, or MDC. Think about it. Hopefully it's straightforward for you. Oops, I forgot to cut that slide. This is a picture of a family in Bhutan. So there was this series a couple of years ago. I can't think of the name of the series, but basically the guy went around to all these different households and had them bring everything they could out of the house so that he could take a picture of them with their possessions. So looking at these people here in Bhutan, looks like kids are the same everywhere, won't cooperate for the picture. I would say LDC. So hopefully you got that one right. Okay, Cuba. Cuba is right here. Got your arrow. 90 miles south of Florida. It is in the Caribbean. It is a communist country. They are a major sugar producer still today, but especially in the 19th century, they were, I think, the largest sugar producer in the 19th century. And they had large numbers of African slaves, as you probably are familiar. Ramon Castro is associated with Fidel Castro, the longtime leader of Cuba. And basically, as you are probably aware, Cuba is still a communist country, still pretty much closed off from the rest of the world. So thinking about what you know so far, LDC, NIC, or MDC. Think about it. Let's find out. Got another family here with all of their worldly possessions. You might be surprised to see some modern amenities that we're used to. And I realize, okay, these are like ancient TVs. First of all, this picture is at least 10 years old. I think it's actually more like 20 years old. But, you know, they have TVs and they have, I think this is a refrigerator, it looks like right here. They've got fans, they've got bikes, they do have cars. Cuba is kind of famous for their vintage cars that, you know, they haven't imported cars from America since the 50s because we started an embargo early in 1961, I think, against Cuba. And the embargo was lifted during the Obama administration, but it's kind of a Cuban claim to fame to have these like 50s and 60s era cars. I would say, despite the modern amenities, they are an LDC. And my reason for that is that it is still a very limited economy. They don't have the trading capability that many others do. Okay, Mali. Mali is in Western Africa. There's your arrow. Help you out again. They have vast mineral resources and cultural wealth, as in a wealth of cultural history. At one time, Mali was a very wealthy kingdom. They say that Mansa Musa was potentially one of the wealthiest men in all of history, and he was the king. I don't remember the term, maybe not the king, but he was the leader of Mali. This was several centuries ago, but still. As a former French colony, and so many of these kind of Saharan or just starting to ease into the sub-Saharan region, so many of these countries are French colonies. For perspective, France is right here. So when thinking about colonizing, it's not terribly far away. This is a picture of a family in Mali. As you can see from their worldly possessions here, they don't seem to have a whole lot. It looks like a lot of vessels for water and for cooking, for storing grains and things like that. But they appear to be lacking in a lot of the creature comforts that you and I are used to. I see a bicycle here, but I don't see a whole lot else. So despite having mineral wealth, despite having some deposits of minerals, the people within the country are largely still very impoverished. So I would say an LDC. Kuwait, you may or may not be familiar with Kuwait here in the Middle East. Kuwait is not the cause, but Kuwait is the reason that the United States decided to invade Iraq in the 1990s. They are obviously a very small country, as you can see. They have vast petroleum resources. That is what drove their neighbor here, Iraq, to invade, because it is a tiny country. Iraq is much larger by comparison, and they have a much larger military and much larger infrastructure, or at least at the time. So they chose to try to invade Kuwait. Their economy flourished in the 20th century, the 1900s. Why do you think that is? Well, they've got vast petroleum resources, and we like to use a lot of petroleum. That is another reason why the United States rushed to their aid. We want to have a country that is willing to trade with us, especially when they have a resource that we really want. So this is a picture of a family living in Kuwait City, which is a city within Kuwait, obviously. You can see quite a bit of wealth here. Again, please remember that these pictures are at least 10 years old. I think more like 20 years old. So if the cars and stuff look dated, this is like late 90s, early 2000s. I know this satellite dish is like a giant, weird satellite dish. They all have these big satellite dishes. This is what a satellite dish looked like when I was a kid. People used to have them in their yard. We used to try to play in them like they were massive. So this is not a sign of an LDC, even though it might look weird to you. This is an MDC. Look at this couch, or these couches. They've got all these cars here. They've got, I don't know, all kinds of stuff. Looks like a bedroom set, another set of furniture, maybe some more furniture here. They are a wealthy family. Check the tiger skin rugs, it looks like. I guess. So anyway, this to me would be an MDC. Okay, South Africa, obviously here in South Africa. They have a lot of mineral wealth. You may or may not be familiar with that. They've got several deposits of valuable minerals that are helping to bring wealth to their economy. They do have the legacy of apartheid that they're still trying to overcome, that segregation that was in a lot of ways much more intense than the segregation that we faced in the United States. So they have kind of two parallel societies in some ways still. We're going to look at the city of Soweto specifically. There was a major riot in Soweto during the apartheid era. So a lot of the city was destroyed or heavily damaged and had to be rebuilt. So this is a part of the city that was damaged during the riots. I don't think it was totally destroyed, but it was damaged during the riots. In terms of GDP, in terms of some of those measurements that we see from HDI, South Africa is an MDC. So this lifestyle that we see here might not be what you and I are used to when we think of a wealthy area, but look at the goods that they have inside their home. They have a TV, they've got a refrigerator, they've got a freezer, they've got an iron, they've got a stove top, an electric or gas, I can't tell, but they've got a lot of creature comforts that you or I would recognize. So even if maybe their house seems pretty small, I mean, their roof, to me doesn't look like it's in the best of quality, but with all of the appliances that they've got and all of the furniture that they've got, this is considered an MDC. Okay, Mongolia, here in Central Asia. So here's China, here's Russia, Mongolia in between. Mongolia is sparsely populated. It is a formerly communist country that is now democratic. Maybe not surprising with the Russia-China sandwich they've got going on there. 1/3 of the people are nomadic or semi-nomadic, and 1/3 of the people live in the capital city, which I can honestly say I don't know what it is. So I'm sure somebody out there can correct me. This is an example of a yurt. There are a couple of different names for this, but the name I would use is a yurt. So it is a nomadic or semi-nomadic structure. And it looks like these guys, they are living here. I would say they're probably semi-nomadic, that they have probably two kind of home bases that they go back and forth between. And we do see, okay, they've got a TV. I think this is a sink, it looks like. I'm not exactly sure. That looks like a sink to me. So this is a tough call. They've got the TV, they've got some appliances, maybe they've got like a lot of this stuff. Okay, this was purchased. Like nobody made these ceramics. They bought this stuff somewhere, which implies that there's like a store for them to be able to buy this stuff. Even with their appliances, I would say that this is an LDC, probably because of the emphasis on agriculture. When we see agriculture, we tend to associate with LDCs, and the nomadic lifestyle in general is associated with LDCs. Japan, you should know, hopefully. Japan here in East Asia. Here's China. Here's, excuse me, here's China. Here's North and South Korea. Here's Japan. There are major changes in Japan in the last century. Consider World War II and the complete destruction to Japan and Japanese society in the 1940s as a result. And then to rebuild from that point, honestly, is kind of amazing. Most people in Japan live in urban areas. Many of them live on the coast. I mean, obviously, it's not a huge territory in general. It would be kind of challenging to live too far away from the ocean, but there are similarities and differences between Japanese and American families that you may be surprised by. So I'm just going to get right to it. Remember, like I keep saying, 90s, early 2000s, but just looking at the stuff that they've got here, there's like a personal TV, like probably from someone's bedroom. They've got some kind of a keyboard situation here, some crutches. There's a washer dryer unit, another TV. Looks like a lot of things. I can't tell what this is here. If it's like a computer or some kind of toaster or something, I don't know. but I would say MDC based on just the appliances and the stuff that we can see. There's a car back here. This looks like maybe their garage door or something. No, I don't know what this is. But anyway, quite a wealthy family. Okay, Iceland, again, you may or may not already kind of know about Iceland, but here it is next to Greenland. It is a highly developed country. They have many natural energy resources. One of the claims to fame in Iceland is the use of geothermal technology. That because it is an active volcanic island, there are all these there's all this access to like steam and natural energy below the soil. So they use a lot of geothermal energy in general. And we see here they've got a family with some friendly donkeys, I guess. I don't know. I'm sorry, I'm not, I guess, a big nature person. I have no idea what these animals are, but we see some expensive instruments, TV, washer dryer, refrigerator, freezer, a writing desk, some leather couches, cars in the background, some construction equipment. So this is an MDC in the late 90s, early 2000s. Obviously, a lot of things that you and I would be used to seeing in our homes. Mexico. Hopefully you know where that is, just south of the United States. It is the world's largest Spanish-speaking country in terms of population. They have gone through rapid industrialization. They have an emerging middle class. So think about LDC, NIC, MDC. Oops, increasing urbanization, sorry. So this is Mexico. We've got obviously a couch. It looks like, I guess that's a toy pistol or something, but TV, clock, some bicycles. I think these are speakers, maybe. Couple of beds. Oops. Couple of beds. To me, this is an NIC because they are an emerging economy, but they are not fully developed yet. There has been rapid industrialization and rapid urbanization, but again, they're not finished with that process yet. But in terms of the clothes and stuff, I know it's like dated, but they're basically wearing clothing just like you and I would have worn. If your parents were around to stuff you into those 90s dresses, they would have, or if you were around for them to do that, I guess I should say. But that's a very 90s looking happy family to me. Okay, United States. Again, this one I really hope you know. It is the third largest country, the largest national economy, 3/4 Christian. Not sure. Here we go. The perfect late 90s American family. They've got their dog, some kind of studio lights. I don't know if these are the photographers or the families, but they've got TV, they've got a couple of cars. Looks like they've got a nice like buck and maybe a doe here. I can't tell what that is. I think they have a waterbed. That's a classic 90s purchase right there. They've got a microwave, it looks like. All kinds of appliances. So obviously an MDC in case you were not aware. Samoa, over here in the South Pacific, I guess you would say. It was formerly called Western Samoa. They have a traditional culture with some modernization. They do heavily embrace Christianity. It's very, very dominant in Samoa. And there are several cultural examples that we have learned of recently of Samoa, but what we see is still a heavily traditional society. You can see like hand-woven mats here. some pig, looks like, excuse me, some cows, kind of an open air living structure here. So this society is heavily agricultural, and I would say they are an LDC at this point. Didn't even notice this, I guess, chicken here. But they are, again, rapidly changing. So another 20 years, 30 years, 40 years could potentially bring us a different picture. Okay, to wrap it up once and for all, how do we know LDC versus MDC? In an LDC, per capita incomes are low, capital is scarce. Capital is the goods and services people use to run a business. In an MDC, per capita incomes are high, capital is readily available. Wealth in an LDC is undistributed. So 2.6% of the population in Colombia owns 40% of the national wealth. Whereas in an MDC, wealth is much more distributed. And don't get me wrong, there's still very rich people that control way more than they probably should. But access to resources is much more distributed in an MDC. LDCs, the primary industries dominate national economies. Primary as in farming, fishing, mining, forestry. In MDCs, manufacturing and service industries dominate the national economies. In less developed countries, people are highly engaged in subsistence agriculture. In developed countries, farming is commercial. In LDCs, populations are rural, but cities are growing. You know, we've talked about those mega cities and even the meta cities. Many of them are in LDCs or NICs. In MDCs, the populations are urban. Cities are growing, but much more slowly. In LDCs, birth rates and death rates are still high. Life expectancy is low. There tends to be more children because the birth rate is still so high. In MDCs, birth rates and death rates are low. Life expectancy is high. There tends to be a much higher elderly population. To think about Italy and the coronavirus again and why they're being hit so hard by it. You know, we talked about their population pyramid way back in Unit 2. I showed you a PowerPoint. I think I showed you the one with the old men sitting on the bench smoking. You know, this is why Italy is being affected so heavily by the coronavirus. Less developed countries have inadequate or unbalanced diets. They potentially are facing malnutrition. MDCs have adequate supplies of food and balanced diets. We do see malnutrition still in MDCs, but it's usually because people are eating too much and eating too much of bad things. In LDCs, diseases are common. In MDCs, there's a relatively low incidence of disease, and there's good medical care available most of the time. In LDCs, there's overcrowding, poor housing, few public services, and bad sanitation. In MDCs, social conditions are generally good. In LDCs, there are poor educational facilities, high levels of illiteracy, whereas in MDCs, educational opportunities are excellent. There's high literacy, and in LDCs, women may be held in an inferior position in society, whereas in MDCs, women are increasingly treated on equal terms with men. Still working on that. I'm going to leave it here. I've got a couple of videos, but I'm going to save those for another day because this was a really lengthy PowerPoint. So thank you for cooperating, and I hope that you are learning a little bit about economic development, social development, and demographic development, and I hope that I get to hear from all of you soon. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe.